Welcome to the second installment in talks on the anthropology of religion, money, and the economy. And I am really delighted and happy to welcome Caitlin Zaloom here. And Caitlin actually is responsible for giving me a little bit, she doesn't realize this, but gave me the idea. She was talking last year at the anthropology meetings about this really exciting project looking at the intersection of the economy and religion and money, and I just thought it was really fascinating and was curious to see other people in our field sort of beginning, so Jane Gayer and other people like that. So in part, it's thanks to her path-breaking work on the topic that we're all here. Caitlin is a cultural anthropologist and assistant professor of social and cultural analysis at NYU. And she has a book which some of you have read called Out of the Pits, Traders and Technology, From Chicago to London, which is absolutely marvelous if you haven't read it. And she's doing two projects right now. She can tell us the one that she's working on now, and then she's also completing a study of the social implications of an emerging trend in neuroscience, which has been pretty fascinating. I read a little bit about it, trying to understand a field that links, I'll read it, a field that links decisions to the neural substrate, challenging traditional understandings of autonomy and choice. And now we're going to hear about her current research, which is looking about how middle-class Americans live with debt. And the title of her talk, I love the title, is God's Economy, Living with Debt in Evangelical America. So welcome, Caitlin.
Thanks, and thanks for having me here, and thanks to Melissa for organizing this. So as you could tell from the description of my work, I'm rather new to religion, and I'm actually much more well steeped in the anthropology of the economy and the anthropology of science. So any feedback on religion, I am very welcome to it. This is actually a sphere that I'm just entering into myself. And so today I'm going to talk about some research that I've been doing in Bay Area megachurches around financial ministry programs. And I see this as part of a kind of broader project that includes both the neuroscience part, which I'm going to now not ever talk about again, and the financial traders, which is about contemporary forms of financial discipline. And by discipline, I don't mean not spending. Rather, I mean how people learn to live virtuously with money. And that might mean not spending, but then it also might mean learning to spend, or to invest, or to trade, or to give credit, or to live with debt, but all in relation to specifically contemporary forms of economic virtue. In particular, I'm interested in an age-old problem in Americans' relationship with money, and of course one that's recently taken center stage in the financial meltdown that is happening, perhaps with particular intensity around my home area of Lower Manhattan. And that's debt. And I think of debt kind of expansively, not just as the condition of negative equity, but also as the possibility of living beyond one's current means. So I think about debt as what might happen as well as what has already happened. And to begin to understand these relationships between economic virtue and money, I'm asking here, how do people learn to live with debt? And that focuses me in on the techniques that people use to approach debt and the consumer world. And in particular, it means examining discourses and practices around debt and around money more generally. So, in addition to religious tenets, which I'm going to talk about today, this project is also going to address popular discourses, media discourses, public policies, and also family practices that have shaped Americans' economic attitudes and financial practices. Today, I'm going to talk more about the work of specifically evangelical churches and ministries to address the problem of debt among believers. And this represents, of course, a very particular set of discourses and practices that have emerged around debt in America today that revolve around the central issue of living a virtuous life financially. And that's the relationship between religious belief and consumer practice. To give you an idea about where I'm going here, first I'm going to talk a little bit about cultural and social scientific ideas about the relationship between money and virtue. Then I'll talk about the field work that I've been conducting with these evangelical megachurches in the Bay Area. And just to give you a preview, these churches have what they call biblical financial ministries. And Abundant Life Christian Fellowship, which was kind of the anchor church where I was working, has the most developed of these programs. And that means that they have 60 biblical budget counselors on site, a continuous rotation of scripturally based financial Bible study classes, and a pastor whose sermons frequently touch on the issue, or on the conflict, really, between American consumer culture and the kind of Christian life that he espouses. And these churches are actually part of a nationwide and more sporadically international movement to reform Christians' economic practices, to bring them more in line with scriptural principles. And specifically in these ministries, American consumer desires represent a really perilous challenge to the integrity of believers' relationships with God. And so I'm going to talk about that much more later. And then last, I'll end by suggesting how Christian financial ministry might point to problems within American consumer culture more generally that extend well beyond the church. But before I get started, I want to dismiss one set of characters that may come to mind when I say Christian finance, and that's the prosperity gospel folks. So this is Creflo Dollar. He's probably the most famous of the prosperity gospel preachers. And this is a set of beliefs about God kind of wanting everyone to be rich and kind of waiting for people to come to the realization and get rich. And this is actually these are not the people that I'm talking about. So I wanted to set Creflo aside before we proceed. Actually, the person who I would more have you think about is this guy, who is much more recognizable probably, and although certainly a lot less flashy looking. And I bring up Benjamin Franklin as a way to start to think about the Protestant work ethic, which is of course one of the ways that we think about the relationship between virtue, productivity, and money in America. And the Protestant work ethic is specifically about work, rather than about money directly. But in his famous tract, The Way to Wealth, Franklin also has much to say about both debt and consumer desires. And his intent in writing the Way to Wealth, which is the kind of source of many of Benjamin Franklin's kind of pithy statements that you all know by heart and probably don't know where they came from, was to instill both virtue and knowledge in the reader. This is what he was going for. He was trying to promote a kind of virtuous relationship between productivity, money, and virtue. So I just picked out a couple of these because they're sort of charming, and I think it sets up our American relationship to money. So on consumer covetousness, he says, if you desire many things will seem but few. And a couple on debt. So rather to go to bed supperless than rise in debt. And when you run in debt, you give another power over your liberty. Of course, Benjamin Franklin was taken up by Max Weber, one of the founders of social science, as an exemplary Puritan striver and the voice of the American creed of prosperity. And Weber wrote about Franklin and Franklin's milieu in the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. More dour yet, Max Weber. And the social science, this social science classic, the Protestant ethic, was written to explain why capitalism appeared where it did in Northern Europe and when it did in the 17th century. But I'm sort of less interested in the many debates about whether or not that thesis is correct than the particular ethical relationship between money and God that Weber saw in the Calvinists. In particular, he focuses on the labor of financial bookkeeping and the doctrine of predestination, which in his writings, if the believer's business was profitable, this is the evidence that that the proprietor was perhaps a member of God's elect. So it was a way of kind of resolving anxiety. So success with money and with material goods resolve the anxiety of proving that in fact you were going to go to heaven. And then there was material proof of this, which was that in the kind of neat lines of doubly entered numbers in the account book. So there was a way of actually showing the proof as well as feeling it. So Weber was actually less, I believe, interested in explaining the details of history than trying to unearth the origins of particular kind of capitalist compulsion to labor. But he was also offering an origin for the sense of virtue that we have tied to living without debt. And in this sense, the Protestant ethic could be understood as a kind of allegory about the present, or at least about modern economic conditions. And part of his explanation for modern economic conditions was actually that the explicitly religious content of the Protestant ethic drops out, right? So the religious framing of our financial lives has faded away and has left behind a Protestant ethic without biblical reference. So we don't know that we're thinking about God any longer. But of course, both Franklin and Weber's writings replay biblical understandings of debt. When you run in debt, you give to another power over your liberty is pretty much a rephrasing of a very of another biblical statement. And some of these biblical understandings are that debt corrupts, debt keeps Americans from pursuing their best interests and God's intentions, and is perhaps a mark of divine disfavor. So with or without direct scriptural references or clerical interpretation, debt remains a mark of depravity. And just to give you a couple of biblical examples, Proverbs 22:7, borrow is servant to the lender, and Romans 13:8, owe no man anything but to love one another. Okay, there's one other idea about debt that I want to mention and then not mention again, which has been a very powerful one, which is the mortgage. Okay, so this message is coming not from our founding fathers or from scripture, but actually from the U.S. government. And this is the idea of that some kinds of debt are good, in particular mortgages and home ownership, which support home ownership as a cornerstone of the American dream. And this is something that began during the New Deal and expanded most famously as a condition of the GI Bill of Rights in the post-World War II moment. And so you got pictures like this of the returning GI and his lovely bride contemplating the material reality of their home in the blueprint of their house to be. Definitely a picture of domestic virtue. And then, of course, this is the American landscape of that kind of domestic virtue. Thousands of houses strung together in neat lots in Levitt towns all over the country. But I don't want to. This is another place I'm not going to discuss, and it's actually, this is another part of the project that I'm working on now, and it's very interesting, particularly given the subprime mortgage crisis, because of course the idea that everyone should be a homeowner was at the heart of that problem. But the contemporary situation today, of course, is very different than anything that we inherited from Franklin or Weber, or even that has anything to do with the returning GIs from World War II. And this is a situation of little saving among Americans, of subprime mortgages and their defaults, and in the religious realm, the growing popularity of a very personal kind of Christianity, which is significantly different from the Calvinism that Weber was so taken by. So I'm asking, how is the contemporary relationship between virtue and money coming into being? And I want to propose that we can see the emergence of a new relationship in these evangelical financial ministries which we might think of it as a Protestant consumer ethic. So now I'm going to tell you a little bit about the ethnographic work that I did work over the course of basically the last year in Bay Area mega churches, all over the San Francisco region that each had 5,000 members or more, and these were. I moved to Northern California from New York. I think not expecting there to be quite so many mega churches, and found myself surprised when I realized that that sandwiching the Stanford campus where my office was were two 5,000 person churches. I mean, within like 2 miles, and I found this surprising, not knowing much, but now know that I in fact should not have been surprised, because those were only 2 of several mega churches in the Bay Area, including Abundant Life Christian Fellowship, which is where I did most of my work, and even the much larger Jubilee Christian Center in San Jose, which has 10,000 members. But I worked primarily with 4 of these mega churches, and then within that, mostly at Abundant Life because they had the most developed programs. ALCF was responsible for, as I mentioned, 60 budget coaches, a constant rotation of financial Bible study classes, and then they also trained most of the Christian budget coaches throughout the Bay Area. So people from churches all over the area would come to Abundant Life to be trained. While I was there, I participated in a 7-week-long financial Bible study class. This day-long seminar, which was very, very intensive, full of PowerPoint slides, called Journey to True Financial Freedom. And I met with I met with the Bible study ministers and their participants. I interviewed them all, and I participated also in meetings of the budget coach training course. So I became steeped enough in this stuff so that I could pretty much begin to anticipate what people were going to say to me, which is always the mark that perhaps you're now able to write about a subject. So within this kind of world of Christian financial advice, there are several kinds of experts who are trying to engage church members in the Protestant consumer ethic. The first are what I basically think of as media celebrities, and these include celebrity pastors, people like Rick Warren, and people like another name you may know is Ron Blue. Also Christian radio personalities, and their secular versions, Dave Ramsey and Susie Orman. These people all come into the sphere of financial ministry. Then there are 2 significant national media ministries as well. Crown Financial Ministries, which is the larger of the 2, and the one I'll talk about, and also Good Sense Ministries, which is out of Willow Creek Community Church in Barrington, Illinois. But Crown is far larger and was the program that my church used. And then the third set of financial experts are Christian counselors, local pastors, and church members working in the financial ministries. And all of these people are focused on both defining the challenges and also defining techniques for living in the material world as an evangelical Christian. So the issue is to define the problem. What is the problem for evangelicals? And then how do you get out of it? And the techniques in particular are geared toward forging connections between God's kingdom and the material world. Now, this is not a perspective that's opposed to consumption. So it's not about negating the material world, but actually encouraging consumption according to Scripture, and trying to interrupt what these people see as a real problem in church members' lives, and that's the appearance of a separate economic world in parallel to in parallel to God's kingdom, or in parallel to the spiritual world. They see this as being a real, which is of course a hallmark of modern organization, but which is a real problem for evangelical Christianity. Okay, so why is this a particular problem for evangelicals? And so I want to just, I mean, many of you may know this distinction already, but I want to just remind you of the distinction between fundamentalists and evangelicals, because I think it draws out part of why this is such a pressing problem for evangelical churches in particular. Both fundamentalists and evangelicals are theologically conservative and also committed to the literal truth of the Bible. Fundamentalists tend to reject engagement with the world, but evangelicals are very different in that they look for ways to interact with the world outside of the church. It's what the sociologist Christian Smith called an engaged orthodoxy. And that comes with a couple of imperatives. One theological imperative, which is to convert souls, and also a practical imperative, which is to keep people coming to church, to draw people into the church. And that has led to the use by evangelical pastors, the use of tools from the kind of familiar contemporary environment to keep people coming to church. And this was really famously used by Bill Hybels at Willow Creek Community Church. When he actually used market research to build the church and to find out what people wanted from their church experience and what kinds of places they were comfortable coming to. And so Willow Creek ended up looking basically like a corporate office park, and included all the things that we now think of as being the hallmarks of megachurch of megachurches, like kind of appealing pop music during Sunday services. So using forms from outside the world to promote a Christian religious life. But this kind of engagement really poses a danger also for conservative Christians, because it opens them to influence from worldly perspectives, right, in contrast to godly perspectives. And of course, Christians, like most other Americans, are subject to stimulation of consumer culture. And so these stimulations, these kind of worldly stimulations, come in through a couple of ways. One is through media, and the other is through social comparison. And this of course, kind of targets two hallmarks of our contemporary environment: advertising, and then how we live in urban and suburban environments. And so financial ministry is a kind of response to this pull of consumerism and spending, and also the failure to tithe that many churches, that put many churches in financial trouble as well. Okay, so I don't want to spend too much time on this because I want to skip ahead of it, but so the Crown Financial Ministries is the kind of template that many of these churches use to address this problem. And Crown is an organization out of exurban Georgia. They were founded in 1976, and they claim to have touched 50 million people in over 40 nations, which sounds like kind of an unbelievable number, but they also claim to have 250 employees and over 10,000 volunteers, and that I can believe much more readily. Anyway, regardless, they're in tens of thousands of churches across this country and in other places worldwide, and it's this kind of media empire. They have radio programs. You can listen to them on WABS AM 780 here in Washington, if you would like to tune in. They have ministry materials for financial Bible study classes, videos, readings, workbooks for life study groups, separate materials for the poor, the wealthy, and the middle class. And I just brought a couple of little things. These are sort of little show and tells. And the materials are interesting in and of themselves, because these are things that are now distributed to these tens of thousands of churches. They provide standardized materials for these churches and create a financial public. They also offer a specific kind of critique of worldly economic values, and at the same time they transmit techniques for managing this boundary between God's kingdom and the world. And that's both affective, a kind of affective management, right, describing the kind of proper Christian attitudes toward materialism, and also the kind of application of Christian living through personal adjustment. Okay. So the central problem that such a standardized regime faces is that the experience of this conflict between the consumer world and God's kingdom depends on the local context in which believers encounter it. And the effectiveness of the program depends on intimacy among church members, not a reliance on the standardized message. So there's this alternation between the kind of standardization and this localization, personalization. Localizing this national financial ministry really depends on the volunteers at the church level and this engagement of financial life groups, so small groups, which is generally how mega churches operate anyway. So it fits very, very well in that. And together, these smaller groups kind of find ways to mediate the dangers of the material environment that come into their discourse through very particular ways. I mean, there's advertising. They talk a lot about advertising, but they also talk a lot about houses, and maybe this is particular to California, but cars also come up all the time, as well as comparisons. So you hear the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses" quite frequently. So I just want to talk to you a little bit about two sets of dangers that the consumer environment poses, and both this kind of standardized scriptural response and more intimate responses to realigning the relationship between the material world and God's kingdom. So first, media messages. That's Paul Shepherd, who's the pastor of Abundant Life. Okay, so this is Howard Dayton. He's one of the key Crown folks, and he says, "We live in one of the most affluent cultures the world has ever known, and we are constantly bombarded with costly manipulative advertising whose purpose is to prompt us to spend money." Hard to argue with that, right? Pretty basic. I think that the people who are on the ground at Abundant Life also speak about it in very similar ways. So this is Janice, who is talking to me about this similar problem. She says, "Everybody's vying for my money. We don't really see it because we live in America and we're used to it, but our periodicals, our television ads, our radio ads, our flyers in the mail, everybody wants your money. I can't tell you how each week I get blank checks from my credit card company." And then, but so on the one hand, this is very kind of standard, I think standard fare, kind of a standard critique of advertising. But the difference between this and more secular forms of consumer critique are the techniques that they pose to alleviate the problem. So Howard Dayton wants us to. Oh wait, this is actually an outtake from Howard Dayton's book, which I think sums it up very neatly in this lovely kind of rationalist form of the chart. Where your income goes up, your spending goes up, your debt slavery goes up, and of course discontentment, which is the biggest enemy, also goes up as well. So that's Howard's definition of what the core problem is. But so the techniques that he's offering are to seek godly counsel, and that's the kind of scripturally based standard way. And he puts it this way: "From time to time, we all get hooked on something we think we must buy: a car, home, camera, boat, you name it. Once hooked, it is easy to rationalize a purchase. Please remember to seek the Lord's guidance and the counsel of a godly person when confronted with a spending decision." Now, Janice has a different kind of approach, and I really like this approach because I thought that it captured really neatly the measuring of the spiritual worth of material things very neatly. She said, and this is when she's trying to understand what her relationship between the things that she wants and the spiritual demands that she would like to place on herself, what their relationship is. She says, "I collected junk mail once and I measured it. In the 12 weeks I collected a 1.5 foot stack of solicitations for money, which was all of advertising, credit card application forms. Send money." And I really like the image of her actually taking out the measuring tape and measuring the pile to render these material things into a space where they were in line with her spiritual values. Living in the Bay Area poses another kind of double danger, and that's idolatry and covetousness, which are all kind of wrapped up together sort of inseparably. And Howard Dayton again has this very nice way of putting it. He says, most idols today have 4 wheels, tinted glass, chrome, and baked on enamel. I thought that was very well said for California. But Dan, who's a budget coach at Abundant Life, and actually a financial professional himself, had another way of putting it. Living in the Bay Area, there's so many millionaires, and seeing all of them drive around in fancy cars and hearing about them constantly in the news and knowing they're just down the street from you makes people feel like they've got to spend more. I know the pressure of seeing all these millionaires around, all these designer clothes and designer cars. So I think people find discontentment around here. There's an uneasiness about your situation if you don't have these material things. And I think covetousness has a really interesting status here because it's not actually just the worship of the stuff, but actually it's this kind of what might be construed here as idolatry is also the desire to have this mark of being one of America's economic elect. So strangely, it has this sort of reversal of the Protestant ethic coming back to haunt Protestants as well, and the acquisitive discontent that he's pointing to also appears as a kind of inappropriate focus. So and this is Lester. He's also a budget coach at ALCF. He says, this is such an affluent area. I think affluence is a killer to the gospel because people who have too much tend to feel self-sufficient. That rich guy on the hill, that guy who's got 10 cars and millions of dollars, they may think that they don't need God. And again, this is a kind of reversal of the Protestant work ethic. Property ownership here is actually a mark of spiritual distraction rather than a mark of spiritual distinction. It's a sign that people are too focused on the accumulation of goods, and their goods provide evidence that people are not relying on God, but rather reveling in their own self-sufficiency. So the self-sufficiency that Americans like to think of as being the be-all, end-all of economic citizenship is really an undermining force. So the techniques that they offer here, I'll get to that in a second, is to understand consumption as stewardship, okay? And stewardship, of course, is a very prominent theme in the Bible. And the first way of doing this is to transfer ownership to God, okay? So this is a piece of the Crown financial materials. It's a quit claim deed. I'm not enough of a lawyer to tell you if that's actually a kind of thing in the world or not, but obviously they are trying to mimic a legal document here. And I'm also, besides the idea that you actually are kind of materially affecting this transfer of ownership by listing your goods and signing and having witnesses, I'm also interested in the picture of American middle class life that comes up in that standardized representation there, right? So we have a married heterosexual couple with golf clubs and a sewing machine, wedding rings and IBM stock. It's a very traditional sort of 50s-ish picture of what American family life is like. So once you've handed everything over to God, once you've understood that in fact God owns everything and it's whatever is yours is not, whatever is in your care is not in effect yours, the next part kicks in, which is to become God's money managers. Okay, that's the way that they put it. So you're a kind of financial leader of God's resources, and part of that is to find God in your everyday things. And so I wanted to mention two ways that a couple of the Crown participants started to understand this new relationship. And so this is Tanisha, who has actually ended up becoming my research assistant. And so I know that she was speaking about this particular car accident personally, in a very personal way. She really had this. But so Tanisha's response is to hold material things loosely. Okay. She said, understanding that God will provide lets you hold material things loosely. That way, if you get in a car accident, you're not going to be all, oh my gosh, my car, what am I going to do? And plus, what if you have a really nice car and it's damaged? And she drove a heavily leveraged Lexus. It's not the end of the world, but if you hold that car in really high esteem, higher than it should be, you're going to be devastated. Whereas if you hold it loosely, you'll be disappointed and sad, but you'll know that it's a car, and ultimately you'll get another one, and it stinks. Maybe you'll lose some money, but ultimately your needs will be taken care of. And again, this means rendering consumer goods in material terms, taking away that sense of virtue that we may have assigned it through the Protestant ethic. And then Janice again had another really, I thought, beautiful way of finding God in her personal finances. And she mentions this. If we don't give credit to God, then we'll give ourselves credit, or mankind credit. So I started writing it down. Every time God came through with something that I felt undeserving of, whether it was a bonus or a rebate check or things that I didn't ask for and I didn't deserve. Raises, checks in the mail, all those little gifts and surprises. I started giving credit to God for them. And she goes on to mention a bonus retention for staying in her job, where they were laying people off and ultimately were going to lay her off. She mentions like helping a guy weed, and he gives her $200. She mentions a veterinarian, reducing the cost of her cat care by $150, and then also airline vouchers that she got for being bumped on a flight. I mean, so really trying to find out in these incredibly mundane details of financial transaction. And one of the interesting things about this is that receiving money for her is actually a sign of God's beneficence toward the undeserving, right? So this isn't actually about getting money when you deserve it, when you've been virtuous, but rather God giving you money even though you don't deserve it, part of God's grace. Okay, so I'm going to skip this section, but I want to mention one thing, which is one of the reasons that debt and consumer culture is such a big problem for evangelicals is this idea of debt slavery. And the problem here is rooted in the evangelical notion of the personal relationship to God. So you're supposed to be able to, someone who is tuned in, who is living a Christian life, who is participating in God's will be able to actually hear God, or will be able to be moved by the Holy Spirit to pursue God's will in that believer's life, to follow His direction. And debt is a particular problem for this because it actually provides distraction. So instead of listening for God's voice in the world, people are too focused on what it is that Visa wants, right? So there's the anxiety that comes with owing money and with having to pay bills, to stay in a job that perhaps they don't like, that perhaps gets in the way of their ability to perform some kind of ministry work, actually cuts people off from God. It kind of puts static on the line. It makes them too focused on fulfilling worldly obligations when perhaps they should be fulfilling God's obligations. Larry, I forget what I call him. Lester puts it this way. He said, "Money shouldn't be a shackle around your legs. When you're in debt, you're in servitude to your spending habits." So the idea is that, again, that this money relationship, that consumerism, actually provides shackles where, in fact, it's not that we need to distance ourselves, they say, from the consumer world. We just need to be able to infuse the consumer world with scriptural principles that we bring to it from our pastor's teachings and directly from the Bible. So it's a pretty profound problem of communication that they see this money becoming between believers and God. Static on the line. Okay. So by way of conclusion, I wanted to point out one thing, which is that learning to live with consumer culture and the problem of debt and the possibility of debt is a particular kind of contemporary achievement, right? We had to get here. It wasn't that easy, and Christian belief in reason is one way of trying to bring a new kind of relationship into being around this problem of debt. So financial ministries help believers adjust their relationships between God and money in America's consumer environment, and they offer new ways to understand economic choices in light of Scripture, in light of the parables of local pastors and also of celebrity preachers, and also of the methods for applying God's financial principles. This is the part that I skipped, which is all about budgeting, which ends up sounding very much like any kind of budget that your parents or your accountant has ever forced you to do yourself. But at a broader level, Christian financial counseling also offers a kind of explanation for living in the contemporary economic world. Because it directs believers to an idea that God's will and plan, that God's will for them provides a kind of narrative for their own life, okay? Where they might live with forces that they really understand in a much vaguer, much more impersonal way, like economic fluctuations, both at a personal and an economic level. So the teachings focus believers on the idea that God has a plan for them. Economic downturns, of course, we're living in the middle of a huge one, but upswings as well in the economy affect believers in ways that are both very concrete. I mean, and of course they affect believers in the same way they affect everybody else in the economy, losing or gaining jobs, savings, housing, but without necessarily making much sense. So this is where this desire for narrative, I think, comes in. God's plan for that then provides a story, a kind of divine narrative that is revealed both through their choices and the texture of economic life. And it also carries a moral component. Each economic situation contains God's lessons for them. So no matter what the kinds of economic trials that people are being put through, there is, in fact, some kind of lesson to be learned. There's some kind of virtue to be gained, even when the economic choice is more of a trial than a triumph. So the Protestant consumer ethic that these programs promote is not, as I mentioned, not a paradigm that resists consumerism entirely. Instead, it redirects consumption. It provides tools for Christians to make choices which are responsive to values outside those prescribed by the marketplace. And it defines a consumer model guided by God's word and purpose. And in their struggles to resist the values of the marketplace, these Christians are attempting to reinstate a kind of reasoned market action based on commitments to Scripture as a disciplining force. The irony of this is that actually, once they come out of financial budget coaching, they even in Christian settings, they end up looking like perfectly reasoned economic actors, right? So they would live within their current means, balance their checkbooks, avoid credit cards and other uses of consumer debt, keep an emergency fund, and anticipate future needs and save for them. I mean, so nothing that you wouldn't otherwise do from a secular setting. But the difference is the sources for understanding the relationship between consumer culture and virtuous economic life, and the techniques for bringing those relationships into being. Now, this conflict between religious and consumer values is not confined to evangelical Christian beliefs and practices. Rather, I think that we can begin to think more broadly using the conflict here and the techniques that people use to overcome it. to question the relationship between values outside the economic sphere and other kinds of values. And in particular, there's a way in which these kinds of questions that come out of Christian financial counseling also raise questions about our capacity for autonomous choice making, which is of course the kind of centerpiece of neoliberal governance, right? So that we're all supposed to be able to make decisions for ourselves, to weigh and assign value to numbers, to make calculations in our lives as kind of independent actors. But what we see from Christian financial ministry is that actually our choices are implicated with our relationship to the landscape of consumer desires in the places that we live and the imagined communities that we're part of. And they demand a reflection on influence, under whose suggestion do we live. So ultimately, rational and autonomous choice making is an elusive value in and of itself, either because of, say, positively choosing God's purpose as a way to live, you're choosing your constraints, choosing your influence, or the emotional influence of advertising, or the coercive force of debt. But either way, we need to rethink the foundations of consumer reason as we believe in it today.
Hi, that was very, very interesting. Thank you so much. And I'm teaching Weber right now. We did last week, so I have a number of things that are rattling around my head. But it's very clear what the problem and the challenges are, and the way you've laid out the Protestant consumer ethic. I'm not clear. I'd like some more examples on how people, in these counseling sessions, in dialogue with a number of actors, actually do mediate, actually do choose. What are the choices they make in an economic environment? How do they manage, and mediate between the sort of the material world that, is sort of surrounding them and, the sort of the religious worldview that they're being asked to support. That's one thing. And another one, it doesn't directly relate, but I was thinking of the section in Weber where he talks about the parable of the talents from the New Testament. And that's such a curious piece of scripture because it sounds like an invitation to some of the same kinds of Christian stewardship, because the master gets upset with the servant who buries his talents and doesn't make them increase and multiply. And it's so sort of against many of the things that we associate with sort of Christian ideology. And it's used in a number of ethnographic texts in France that look about French bourgeois culture, and that particular parable being used as sort of, an incitement to do volunteer work and help, ameliorate the social condition. But at the same time, you can read it as a very effective way of maintaining the status quo as well. So it's, so that's just something that, I've been sort of that parable, Weber, and the choice, the autonomy. And what people actually do. What do they do to, it's one thing, because you've talked about discursive narratives, but what are they, in sort of insight, what are they sort of admonished to do?
Well, they're admonished to do several things, and I think that this actually gets, kind of crosses over all of your points. The mediation actually comes. I skipped a whole section on the budget, on actually what you do in a budget counseling session, so the first question is or the first way that budget counselors come to approach the problems of the people that come to see them. Most of the people that come to see them are really deeply in debt. They're really in big time financial trouble, and there are plenty of people like that in the Bay Area. All 60 financial counselors at Abundant Life are oversubscribed, and I asked the director of the program there, when they were going to start taking referrals from the Christian radio station that plays the Crown program, and they said, well, when we can meet the demand of our church, we'll start opening ourselves up to these other referrals. But basically, people are in debt, they're really struggling. So the first thing that they try to do is to change people's minds by changing their hearts. And the technique for this, the actual what do they do part, is keep a 30-day diary of their spending, which is, you know, like a perfectly accountant-like approach. But the difference is that is understanding is what that is supposed to be revealing, rather than patterns of just like, you know, unwise patterns of spending. The idea is actually tracking where your heart lies, right? Where your treasure is, there your heart lies also. So that this budget, I mean, in some ways, like the account books of the Protestant, the budget actually provides the evidence of the relationship between you know, your relationship between the kingdom and this material world. How have you been managing it or not? And so people will, you know, write, I mean, they get their check, they write in their spending, they track everything, you know, every piece of gum they have, they stick it in their wallet, and they fill out these very, very long reports, and they you know, try to understand. First, you have to know what you're doing before you can change that. And I think that, you know, the question of autonomous choice actually really powerfully comes in there, because in fact it's the lack of knowledge in this case that's the autonomous choice. So it's a kind of negative idea about what autonomy is, because actually I mean, because you're acting on your own kind of thoughtlessly, and you're not bringing yourself under the discipline of scripture or of biblical teachings. So when the title of their one-day seminar is the Journey to True Financial Freedom, but freedom is not autonomy, right? Freedom is the willing subjugation to scriptural constraint.
So is it about tithing as well? I mean,
and it is about tithing.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, tithing as a biblical principle. They're very strong about this. And you know, many people ask me about tithing. They're really, you know, they want you to tithe 10%, and there's not like a lot of fudging about that. It's very straightforward. Obviously, they can't make you tithe, but there is also this issue, which is that like particularly the megachurches where I was working are enormous organizations with, you know, I mean, themselves something like, you know, 20, 25 people working for the church, and huge services for literally thousands of people, and like all this high tech stuff and screens and videos and daycare and, you know, ministry groups. I mean, thousands of ministry. I mean, they have, you know, if that's what people want, they need to pay in. And so for some reason, this is like the one area in life where people don't actually get a bill for the services that they consume. So that part of it doesn't exactly there's a kind of organizational reason for it as well as a scriptural reason, although they don't address it as an organizational reason. Of course, they address it as a spiritual problem.
And is the church paying the 60 financial counselors as well? They're volunteers.
They're all volunteers.
They're members of the church.
Mm-hmm. So the ministries are all run by members, but they're coordinated by a paid employee. But they're all volunteers.
I have a question that sort of builds, I guess, on your response to Susan's question, and it seems like that all of these that many of the reasons for this financial counseling is because people are in crisis. But yeah. I was sort of wondering if one of the things that the churches propose is that their members are in less debt than sort of the general public. And so I was wondering if there was any kind of discourse of success and look at how good we are, where the churches themselves were using numbers and, you know, and saying, you know, our members are only $20,000 in debt, whereas, you know, like the general public is $40,000, you know, whatever. Is there any of that sort of number crunching, which you would think most financial kinds of groups would actually put out there, or are these all? Is this all about heart and spiritual sort of stuff?
Well, they don't say things like our members are only $20,000 in debt when everybody else is $40,000 in debt. Actually, one of the ways that they try to get church members into these ministries, I mean, as participants, is by saying actually Christians look like other Americans, but there's no distinction actually. That Christians are just in debt, are just as much in debt as other Americans. That actually there isn't any sign of being of living as a different kind of life. So they actually make the kind of opposite claim, and they haven't been selling those numbers at all. And actually, I don't think that they don't keep. I mean, as far as I can tell, they don't keep track of the successes and failures of the programs. I mean, in some ways, it would be really hard to do because these are the relationships in particular between the budget counselors and they call them clients. They actually don't even call them counselors; they call them coaches because it's really hard to get men in for counseling, but they'll come in for coaching. So there are budget coaches and there are clients, and it's like naming the category is very important. But these are relationships that can last over years and can be like going from being $150,000 in debt to being $80,000 in debt, which might be like a big success. I think that they don't keep a lot of stats. They just really sell it in terms of heart and spirit and those things.
I have two questions. One is sort of what is the narrative that's being given to the current economic debt of the country? Sort of how does the national debt get played into picture, since this is such a personalized narrative with God? That's my one question. And then earlier on, you sort of mentioned about Susie Orman's of what's her name? Yeah. Of the world. And I'm very curious sort of to think about sort of how are these ideas and discourses and techniques sort of spreading out into popular culture, into Oprah, and all these other kinds of things. So sort of both questions in larger pictures.
They don't talk about the national debt. I mean, so when like at the end when I was saying like it's a way of making sense of these, kind of nationwide or global economic times of economic volatility. That is not their analysis. I mean, it's very much. I mean, and it's a reflection of the theology too. It's very, very personalized. Everything about it is very, very personalized. It ends up sounding a lot like self-help, which of course has its own Christian origins. So it's everything about it is personalized. They don't actually make anything out of national debt. And actually, the first time that I went to Abundant Life, Pastor Paul was talking about financing the building of their church, because they moved. I mean, it's like a church with just explosive growth, and they had to move from like a smaller building into this office park in Menlo Park. That's of course like right next to a Costco, which is like, I mean, these churches are so big, like you literally need a warehouse space to have enough room for the people who that 3 services, 1,000 people in the church per service every weekend. I mean, but anyway, they were. He was talking about financing this, and even that discourse was just about how they got the money from within the church. So it was kind of interior. It wasn't even an interiorizing narrative at the level of the church itself, and kind of not talking about the connections to the wider economy. These discourses are actually. I mean, the interesting thing is that they're really congruent with many of the kinds of discourses about debt that go on outside of churches, and that's why I think it's actually. I mean, which is an interesting thing. And why I think you have to dig a little deeper to get at the difference there. I mean, because basically whatever Susie Orman would tell you would be exactly the same thing that you would hear. I mean, as far as techniques goes, as the budget coaches at Financial Life, but Susie Orman isn't going to tell you that you need to. Well, she's not going to tell you need to tithe, but she's also not going to tell you that that you need to, bring the spiritual into the
right, but
material
there's another
world.
kind of narrative that she's gonna. I'm just curious as to what you see. Any sort of narrative filtering into the popular? I mean,
yeah. Well, one thing that's really interesting
yeah.
is actually is less Susie Orman than Dave Ramsey, who's the other. Dave and Susie are kind of the gurus, and Dave, as far as I can tell, is a not very a very thinly veiled version of this, and he's very also focused on giving to churches, and one of the things that I think is interesting in the kind of Dave Ramsey version of this is actually his anti-state rhetoric, right? So taxes always come up. I mean, he's very much a kind of a kind of political right guy in his anti-state positions and anti-tax positions. Whereas the and he always says, like, if you have extra money, give it to the church. Whereas actually within these financial ministry programs, there isn't a lot of anti-state rhetoric. I mean, it really is very, very personal. And whenever the state does come up, which is always through taxes, the idea is that you pay them. You don't really question it. It's not. It doesn't come up as an obstruction to anything.
I have a question about whether or not they have kind of a historical narrative, where you were talking about them saying that Christians are not being differentiated from Americans in terms of their spending habits. But if they mobilize a historical narrative, like a return to some kind of maybe 17th century moment when people were using the Bible to kind of guide their lives in much more concrete ways. And I was also wondering if they were encouraging people to like invest their money in Christian investment funds, or if there was that kind of rhetoric as well.
Yeah, that's a really good question. But the temporal narrative that they bring up is actually never a historical one, and I think that is in itself interesting. It's always very much future oriented, but it's future oriented at the scale of the individual life. So it's, what are you going to do going forward, and it isn't a return. There isn't a kind of return to some kind of collective virtuous state. It's always about personal virtue, and so and the way that gets worked out is that we are now moving forward. I mean, and again, it's this. In some ways, it's just like it's so deeply American. We're all moving forward into this prosperous future as individuals together, and so the temporal orientation is definitely kind of like, now in your debt troubles and working toward the future in which perhaps you will have a comfortable retirement. That's about as far as it goes.
Can I just pick up on that, because with Jane Geyer's discussion of the evacuation or the thinning out of the so-called near future, and I know that you responded to it in a very different way in the article in the American Technologist. Where do you see sort of this work or these findings, and particularly this discussion about how people are thinking about the future individually?
Well, one of the things that Jane is very interested in is millennialism, right? So that there's always this end, that end time is always nigh, and so her idea is that kind of evacuates the midterm actions and understanding. So you're just always acting as if the end of the world was coming near. So I didn't respond. I responded in a very different way in that discussion, but that's one of the interesting things about the kind of evangelical Christianity that I've been working in is actually that millennialism is like nowhere to be seen. And I think that there's, first of all, obviously evangelical Christianity is like a very multifaceted thing. There are lots of ways of practicing it. There are lots of different churches that are engaged in it, and this is also an issue about location. In the Bay Area, in the affluent Bay Area, even if people are in debt, nobody wants to hear about the end of the world. Like, there's no hell, there's no there's no end of the world. There's like now and your kids' college and retirement. And you know, it's a very solidly middle class consumerist version of evangelical Christianity. It's not fiery in any way. It's all very ameliorative, kind of therapeutic, as you might expect in a kind of Bay Area idiom.
Yeah.
So it's a different. I mean, what she is talking about is has a kind of specific location.
I'm wondering how the focus on finances, which seems to have this big apparatus behind it with all these volunteer counselors and people who you said have been in counseling for years, if that comes to define this particular congregation, or if they also have an equally orchestrated and enthusiastic apparatus around something else. So I'm thinking about different congregations, maybe their big thing is their sister parish in Haiti, or what. But this is so developed, and it seems like there's so many people involved that this is really important to the church. Now I'm going to ask the elephant in the room. I still don't get why. And the anthropological skeptic in me is wondering, why are so many people invested in this just because of spirituality? Or is it the tithing? What is at the heart of this? Why have thousands of people doing budgets? Is it, do you think, ultimately so that there's this feedback loop to getting committed to the church because the church has helped you? And that can come out in many ways. I don't mean to just say through tithing. Or is it really this sort of clarion call to deal with modernity and all of its consumer crassness?
Well, so the ministry part of it first. I mean, you know, this is a 5,000 person church, and that is in some ways a kind of conservative estimate. So they have lots and lots and lots and lots of ministries that they support. I mean, including you know, I mean, all kinds of missionary work, all kind. You know, I mean, you know, after-school programs for kids, childcare, prison ministries. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. You know, the church has a special magazine just to cover the activities of its members. So there are lots. I mean, there are lots of different ministries to choose from at the church. So it's not necessarily at the. I mean, it is a very, very developed ministry, but it's not necessary. It's not like it's the only thing going on at the church. I mean, and so part of it. I mean, so there are two questions about why people get involved, and one is, why do people get involved as volunteers, and why do people get involved as participants? And you know, people are in. I mean, on the participant side, people are in big time financial crisis. I mean, that's just part of the American economic landscape at this point. And I mean, as we all well know from following the news the last few weeks, and it's getting worse and worse. And the question is, where do people turn to get help for that? And that's part of I mean, I think that's part of my question, is that that people don't necessarily want to turn to and aren't necessarily connected to the kind of secular financial advice that might be available to them, right? Are they really going to call like consumer credit counseling, or are they going to go to the church where they are already a member that has this program for them, or are they going to call up the Christian radio station that they listen to where they hear this program in order to get connected to another kind of financial advisor? I mean, as far as the church goes, I'm sure that tithing is one reason that the pastor is really concerned with helping this ministry develop. But the pastor is actually not particularly involved. I mean, he's supportive certainly, but he's actually not particularly involved. So it's not like they're doing this with a kind of accountancy strategy of developing tithing revenue. the impetus for it really comes from the volunteer base of the church, including the coordinator and also the many people who come to be financial counselors. I mean, of course, there is another issue about the Bay Area that comes in here, which is that there are tons of people who are either business people or in the financial industry who have these skills that they see as transferable from their work life to ministry life. So there's actually a really big range of people who are available to become financial counselors. And so I think that may, I mean, as far as your question is concerned, that might be, that kind of demographic might be the reason that people get involved, is that it's a good way for them to make use of their skills in a spiritual context.
Yeah, I'm interested. I've been struck by how much is the same, from within this sort of church world and outside the church world in terms of how people are thinking about debt or experiencing debt or trying to get out of it. Yeah. And so I guess I want to ask more about what difference it makes. Whether on the one hand, it seemed like maybe people are going to the church for this counseling because they're conceiving of churches kind of all as full service enterprises. So they're in this world and they're looking for everything from, childcare and entertainment and spiritual guidance and debt counseling. But even if even if that's what brings them there, then I wonder, sort of two sides of the question. Does it make a difference for how they're Christians, that they're thinking about their debt in this space? And does it make a difference for how, broadly speaking, as Americans, people think about debt, that there are so many Christians, so many megachurches offering people a way to think about their debt in a spiritual idiom. Obviously, this is a big, evangelical Christianity is a big movement in the States, and so my question sort of in both directions. What difference does it make for Christianity that they're putting this energy to debt, and what difference does it make for American consumer debt culture that so many Christians are thinking about it?
Yeah, those are really excellent questions. I think that the way that it makes a difference for Christianity or for Protestantism, because this is, we're talking about a specific subset here, is about this kind of relationship to materiality, and the location of the spiritual. I mean, this is where I start to get out on kind of a limb, because this is where everything is new to me. But one of the primary distinctions between Protestantism and other forms of Christianity, like Catholicism, is about the relationship to the material world and the infusion or not of spirit into the material world. And so on the one hand, I think that the difference that it makes as Christians is about changing that relationship, about putting on the one hand, putting material things in their material place, so understanding a separation, which might be more aligned with a traditional form of Protestantism. But then also by bringing God into your economic choices, you're actually affecting this. You're affecting a relationship with the material between the material and the spiritual. Through your activity as an economic chooser, which is different than than a relationship with the material world where things are already animated to a certain degree. Is that the act of choosing? Maybe this is where it gets to be even more deeply American. The act of choosing is the thing that instills the stuff with spirit. So I think that's where it makes a difference as Christians. Well, I think, I think that one of the ways in which it makes a difference for Americans is that, I mean, in some ways it's part of the kind of a movement to make churches locations for social services of all sorts. I mean, there are certain secular agencies that are state supported, although there are also there's partially state supported, they're partially credit card company supported, so they're not exactly, agnostic, shall we say, around the uses of credit themselves. But it's I think that it is part of that kind of movement to make to kind of locate social supports in religious contexts.
I wonder if it would be worth, I know you're going to these different spheres and relationships and institutions, but I'm wondering what it would mean if you were to go to another church in, say, North Carolina or somewhere else where, I've done field work there within the last year, and I'm just thinking that there are places that are so economically deprived and where there are no the glossy advertisements are there, but there's no keeping up with the Joneses in the same way, right? So I'm just curious as to sort of how that might, put a wrinkle into all this, and also open up the question, I guess, about the larger question about American culture, and even thinking about geographical, how much did it really matter that you were in San Francisco, or the fact that you may do more field work in New York, another sort of opulent place. Nothing wrong with it, but
could I piggyback onto that, because that's been bothering me too.
Yeah.
In fact, when you had the quick deed up there, and I looked carefully at that list. It doesn't strike me as a typical middle class. Not that it's necessarily representative of X number of people in the church, but when you're talking about stock portfolios, whatever people have their 401ks, but there was rental property. There were a number of things that's not and boats, and sort of things that really, the typical middle class. So I think looking at sort of a mega church in another area. So my question, how does class map onto this American script?
Well, one really interesting thing about that. Well, so first of all, that is from the. That is not from the Bay Area. That's from Georgia. Okay. So all of the materials and all of those materials, the materials that I passed around, those come from Crown, which is located in Georgia, and actually the people that mostly the ministry folks who I talked to in the Bay Area would sometimes complain about the materials that came out of Crown because they were too. They would never say really what they were too much of. But they were not California enough for them, and part of that was very logistical. Like in the kind of sample budgets they would give for people, that the housing portion of the budget would be like way too low, because in the Bay Area, housing is can be 40 to 60% of a person's budget, and that is like a reasonable expectation. Where in Georgia it's like 20 to 30, and that's a reasonable expectation. So there's that very kind of concrete way. But then there was this sense that there was some sort of something culturally off about the materials that had to be located. But you're right. Rental property, and then specifically IBM stock. I'm not quite sure what that list, what we can make of that list. Other than they do have some vision of what middle classness is. Because this is their specifically middle class program. Like this, the book that I handed around is actually the book for the poor people, for the people in North Carolina. And then they have a whole other program which is for really rich people, which is for which some people in the Bay Area were also looking at. But there's there are myriad class dimensions that have very much kind of regional connotations, but I think that the issue, and particularly just for anthropologists in general, because you're always stuck with your locality to a certain degree, is what can you make of that? What can you make of that locality? Like what kind of analytical leverage can you get from that? But obviously the comparative case would also be very interesting.
We have a lot of students in the room, so I'm curious as to if they have...
I was very upfront about what I was doing. As ethnographers are supposed to be, this happens to be one of the contexts in which being an outsider is actually sort of an advantage, in part because of this extroverted is the wrong word because that's personal, but external orientation that evangelical Christianity kind of supports. which is that, you know, if people are around and they're coming around and they want to hear about, you know, God and money and what you're doing, it's essentially because God has brought them there, and
There you go.
and there you go. So it was actually pretty. It was. I mean, not that people don't have their own suspicions or hesitancies, all that kind of thing. But there's a kind of theological support there for the curious outsider that meshes very well with the project of ethnography. So I was happy to inhabit that to inhabit that role for them. And you know, I mean, it was very it was interesting to be in that.
Did you learn anything
role.
about budgeting and stuff? In the reason?
Sure. Yeah,
We really
learned a lot about budgeting, and I learned a lot about the Bible, and I went to a lot of services, which is not what not where I would have otherwise gone on a Sunday morning. It actually was, you know, somewhat hard to get there. It was very I mean, because I have a young child and a Jewish husband, so. But I did. I learned a lot, and I think that one of the interesting things about ethnography, doing this kind of ethnography, is that I mean, it's first that it takes you places where you wouldn't necessarily otherwise go, but then you also learn about these contemporary situations the way that people who are in them learn about them themselves, and so it's less a formal education in the Bible than it is an immersion in kind of Christian culture, you know, in part through this really, Pastor Paul, whose image flashed by there really quickly at some point, is just this incredibly charismatic guy, and so you can, and when you go to one of his sermons, you know, it's perfectly obvious why people like go to hear him every Sunday. And then actually part of the kind of worldly techniques that he employs to get God's message across are it's just humor. I mean, he's clearly studied performance and acting, not formally, but with a very, very sharp eye. And I mean, he's an incredible comedian. He's like a comedian for God. And really, I mean, I don't mean that in anything but a totally complimentary way. And I mean, but like, I mean, the congregation is just cracks up all the time. And so I think that it really gives you a sense that there's something, there's part of the world that you didn't understand before that is really worth knowing about.
How do you anticipate things changing? I mean, we can probably guess that some of those 60 financial counselors are out of jobs themselves, and there's a big difference between trying to get down debt, trying to not buy a new kind of TV even though you have a TV that's 2 years old, and middle class, or I would say, as Susan pointed out from the list, upper middle class, and certainly the Bay Area, upper middle class. There's a big difference between working on debt and now families that have children in college and don't know how they're going to pay the January tuition bill. So how are you going to go at this? I love the way you just said, like, looking at change in the making, looking at really contemporary social phenomenon and how people are making sense of it. But this is almost a state of panic for many.
Yeah, well, but that state of panic was going on while I was there too, and so in one of the churches where I did some work in, it's called Cornerstone Fellowship in Livermore, California. They were getting 3 or 4 people a week who would come and say that their houses were being foreclosed upon. I mean, so not and this is just this one. I mean, granted, this one counselor had like 35 people he was counseling, but this was, you know, kind of one person who I was talking to about it. So the crisis, I mean, I think one of the interesting things is that even when the crisis is not as obvious as it is right now, there's plenty of crisis even in upper middle class families to go around. That's kind of papered over by debt. So that one of the functions of debt over the last 25 years is to continue a middle class or upper middle class standard of living in the absence of income, because we know, I mean, just in terms of economic statistics, that the jobs are not there to support the kind of spending that people have been doing. So the crisis this crisis is now exploding. We all know about it. We can see it. We hear about it all the time. But actually, this is something that's been going on in a much more in a much quieter way for a long time, and the choices that particularly the budget counselors are helping people to make are things like, do we keep our home or do we rent? Do we sell our home and rent? I mean, not that anyone can sell their home now, but or without being completely upside down. But those are tough decisions, and the main counselor at Cornerstone Fellowship that I was just describing actually counsels people to leave the Bay Area, which is tough, right? But the cost of living in the Bay Area is so much higher than it is in Nevada, which is not that far away. That he actually suggests to people that they uproot themselves in order to make themselves financially whole. I mean, so those tough decisions are completely part of this package. They're just going to be many more of them.
I have one last question. What do you think anthropologists have? I mean, if we're learning so much about how, and you're learning a lot, how people are dealing with debt and money, is there anything beyond sort of this analysis? Is there anything that we can do in sort of the more classically applied or way? I mean, do you see your work going that way, or do you see possibilities for anthropology going that way? I mean, where does anthropology fit into sort of that larger picture, besides becoming debt counselors ourselves?
Yeah, well, I don't think that's such a bad. I don't think that would be such a bad idea. But I think that one of the things that is really missing in economic discourse, and this is in particular because of the kinds of experts that the media and policy people rely on, is an understanding of what people are actually going through in their economic choices. And that's actually a really strangely evacuated area. And so I actually think that forming an understanding of what people's everyday decisions are like around debt and financial crisis has a very strong possibility to inform the way that policy makers think about the problem. And the issue is then trying to knock a few economists out of the way in order to get yourself heard. But the kind of models that economists deal in, and of course they're the people that policymakers go to, intentionally obscure those kinds of everyday details that people live with. That is anthropology's stock and trade.
Well, this has been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. This was absolutely fabulous. And thank everybody for coming, and I hope to see you on November 14th as we continue our series.